Picture this: a young Venetian merchant, barely in his 20s, setting out on a journey so vast and uncharted that most of his contemporaries would have dismissed it as pure fantasy. But Marco Polo wasn't just any traveler. His name would one day become synonymous with adventure, curiosity, and the kind of cultural encounters that would forever change how the East and West saw each other. Imagine walking into the court of Kublai Khan, the most powerful ruler on earth at the time, surrounded by splendor so extravagant it defied belief, or bartering in markets where spices, silks, and stories flowed as freely as the rivers. This wasn't just travel, this was a collision of worlds, a tapestry of human connection woven across thousands of miles. And what makes Marco Polo's story so extraordinary isn't just the places he went, it's the people he met, the traditions he witnessed, and the way his experiences shattered the boundaries of what medieval Europe thought possible. Think about how it must have felt to be the first European to describe the grandeur of Hangzhou, a city so immense and vibrant that it made Venice look like a humble village. Or to stand in awe as Mongol warriors demonstrated their unmatched skill with the bow, or to taste flavors so exotic they had no name back home. These weren't just passing observations, they were moments that redefined what culture could be. Marco Polo's travels weren't just about discovery, they were about transformation. Every encounter, from the bustling ports of Hormuz to the snow-capped peaks of the Pamirs, left an indelible mark on him and through his writings on the world. His journey became a bridge between civilizations, proving that even in an age without maps or instant communication, curiosity could unite people across unimaginable divides. So why does this matter to us today? Because Marco Polo's story isn't just a relic of the past, it's a testament to the power of stepping into the unknown. In a time when the world feels both connected and divided, his experiences remind us that understanding begins with encounter. That's what we're about to explore together. 20 of the most astonishing cultural exchanges Marco Polo had, each one a window into a medieval world far more interconnected than we often realize. From the whispered secrets of Persian astronomers to the haunting chants of Tibetan monks, these encounters weren't just remarkable, they were revolutionary. So settle in, because this isn't just a history lesson. It's an invitation to see the world through the eyes of a man who dared to go further than anyone thought possible, and in doing so, changed history forever. Stepping onto the Silk Road for the first time, Marco Polo must have felt like he'd walked into a living kaleidoscope of humanity. The air buzzed with languages he'd never heard, Persian traders haggling in rhythmic verses, Turkic horsemen calling to one another across crowded caravanserais, and the melodic chants of Buddhist monks drifting from roadside shrines. This wasn't just a trade route, it was a sprawling, pulsing crossroads where continents converged. And what stunned him most wasn't the exotic silks or spices, it was how effortlessly people from utterly different worlds coexisted. Nestorian Christians, dressed in robes embroidered with crosses, shared meals with Muslim merchants who paused mid-bargain to kneel toward Mecca. Tibetan monks bartered prayer wheels alongside Jewish scribes selling finely inked scrolls. Every interaction was proof that diversity wasn't just tolerated here, it was the lifeblood of the Silk Road. Take the caravanserais, those sprawling desert inns where travelers rested between grueling stretches of the journey. Inside those sun-baked walls, Marco saw something that would have been unthinkable back in Venice. A Persian poet reciting verses to a circle of Mongol warriors, their faces alight with understanding despite the language barrier. A Eiger blacksmith demonstrated sword-making techniques to a group of wide-eyed European merchants, while nearby, a Chinese physician treated a feverish trader from Baghdad with herbs no one in the West had ever seen. These weren't just chance meetings, they were tiny revolutions, moments where knowledge leaped across cultures like sparks between wires. Marco quickly realized the Silk Road's real treasure wasn't in its saddlebags or chests. It was in the way a shared laugh over a communal meal could dissolve centuries of suspicion, or how the rhythmic clatter of loom weights in a Samarkand workshop sounded eerily similar to those in his hometown half a world away. What made this encounter so transformative for Marco and for history was how it shattered the myth of isolation. Back in Europe, most people believed their civilization stood alone, a beacon in a shadowy world of strangers. But here, on this ribbon of dust and desire, Marco witnessed the truth. The medieval world was already globalized. A mathematical formula born in Baghdad might wind up decorating a ceramic bowl in Hangzhou. A Byzantine melody could echo in the courtyards of Kashgar, reshaped by local musicians until it became something entirely new. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it remixed cultures, creating a living library of human ingenuity. And Marco Polo, with his insatiable curiosity, became one of its most attentive students. His notes on these early encounters read like love letters to diversity, a testament to the radical idea that difference wasn't something to fear but to celebrate. Little did he know, these first steps were just the prologue to an even grander story waiting further down the road. Constantinople hit Marco Polo like a lightning bolt of gold and marble, a city so dazzling it made his native Venice seem subdued by comparison. The moment he laid eyes on the Hagia Sophia, its massive dome floating above the city like a second sky, he understood why travelers called it the eighth wonder of the world. Inside, light streamed through countless windows, setting the golden mosaics ablaze until the very air seemed to shimmer. Figures of saints and emperors gazed down from the curved ceilings, their eyes following visitors as if guarding centuries of secrets. For a young merchant raised in Europe's stone and wood cathedrals, this was architecture as alchemy, where brick and mortar transformed into something celestial. But what truly captivated Marco wasn't just the grandeur, it was the layers of history whispering from every corner. In the bustling markets, Greek philosophers debated under colonnades built by Roman emperors. Armenian merchants haggled over Syrian silk next to Egyptian spice stalls, their shouts blending with the chants of Coptic priests. Even the imperial ceremonies defied simple labels. Byzantine coronations blended Roman military pomp with Persian court rituals, while Easter processions wove together Hebrew psalms and Greek hymns. Here, Marco saw for the first time how a civilization could be both ancient and ever-changing, like a river that never stops flowing yet always remains itself. The rituals of power left him equally spellbound. When Emperor Michael VIII paraded through the streets, it wasn't just a display of wealth, it was a carefully choreographed symphony of symbolism. Chariots draped in Tyrian purple, guards wielding axes forged in Damascus, even the precise cadence of the trumpets, every detail whispered of an empire straddling continents. Marco scribbled notes about the throne room's mechanical wonders, golden lions that roared, jeweled birds that sang, all engineered to humble foreign ambassadors. Yet for all its spectacle, what struck him most was how seamlessly faith and governance intertwined. Unlike Europe's squabbling popes and kings, here the patriarch and emperor moved as one, their authority radiating from the same divine light reflected in the Hagia Sophia's mosaics. This collision of influences reshaped Marco's understanding of cultural exchange. Constantinople wasn't just a midpoint between East and West, it was a living blueprint for how civilizations could absorb without erasing. The same hands that carved Christian icons also inlaid Arabic calligraphy into palace walls. The cooks who prepared Lenten fasts spiced their fish with peppercorns from Malabar. Even the city's defensive walls, stacked like a stone encyclopedia with Roman engineering, Persian siege tactics, and Mongol reconnaissance reports, taught him that innovation thrived where traditions overlap. By the time his caravan prepared to move east, Marco carried more than trade goods. He carried a revelation that the world's greatest cities weren't pure or isolated, but like the Hagia Sophia itself, built layer upon layer, each era leaving its golden trace. The mountain fortress of Alamat loomed like something from a nightmare, sheer cliffs rising into clouds, its walls carved from the living rock itself. As Marco Polo's caravan wound through the valleys of Persia, whispers followed them like shadows. "Beware the old man of the mountain," merchants muttered, their voices dropping to near silence. "He commands men who fear neither blade nor death." The tales spun around campfires painted a picture so extraordinary it straddled the line between history and myth. An order of assassins so disciplined they would leap to their deaths at a single word. A garden hidden behind fortress walls where young recruits awoke, convinced they'd tasted paradise and would do anything to return. What fascinated Marco wasn't just the stories, but how they revealed the power of belief in shaping empires. The Hashashins derived from the Arabic word for hashish users, though scholars still debate if the name reflected reality or slander, weren't mere killers. They were chess pieces in a larger game, their reputation alone enough to make sultans and crusader kings alike tremble. Marco recorded how their leader, perched high in Alamat, could send a single dagger left on a pillow as warning, and cities would surrender without a fight. No army required, just the chilling certainty that resistance meant death from nowhere. But here's where Marco's account gets truly revealing. Unlike European chroniclers who painted the assassins as demonic cultists, he noted their strategic brilliance. They didn't slaughter indiscriminately, they targeted with surgical precision. A corrupt vizier here, a warmongering general there, each killing sent a calculated message. Their weapon wasn't just the knife, but the legend woven around it. And that legend worked because of something Marco understood firsthand after years in the East. The medieval world ran on stories. The old man of the mountain wasn't just a commander, he was a storyteller who weaponized mystery. Digging deeper, Marco uncovered layers even locals debated. Some claimed the Hashashins were political idealists fighting tyranny. Others swore they were mercenaries for hire, their blades going to the highest bidder. What struck him was how their myth outlived their power, how this brotherhood, small in number, left footprints across 3 continents worth of nightmares. By the time his quill touched parchment, Marco knew he wasn't just documenting assassins. He was capturing humanity's oldest truth, that faith, whether in gods or commanders, could move men faster than any army. And in Alamat's shadow, he'd glimpsed the dark alchemy of fear and devotion that would echo through history long after the fortress's stones crumbled to dust. The deserts of Persia shimmered like molten gold under the midday sun when Marco Polo first glimpsed the slender towers rising from the sand's silent sentinels, marking the entrance to a world unlike any he'd known. In the ancient city of Yazd, fire wasn't just a tool or a symbol. It was alive, tended by white-robed priests who moved with the precision of astronomers charting the heavens. These were the Zoroastrians, guardians of flames said to have burned without ceasing for 500 years. To Marco, raised in the candlelit cathedrals of Venice, the sight was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Here was a faith that worshipped not a crucified savior, but the very element his own tradition associated with hell. What unfolded before him was a theology woven into every gesture. Priests fed the sacred flames with sandalwood using silver tongs, never their bare hands so as not to pollute the fire's purity. They chanted verses from the Avesta, their ancient scriptures, as sunlight streamed through vents in the temple ceiling, intersecting with the rising heat to create pillars of shimmering air. Marco learned that to these worshippers, fire was more than a god. It was the visible breath of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, locked in an eternal struggle against the darkness of Angra Mainyu. This cosmic duel played out daily in rituals where even the placement of fuel followed celestial patterns, an earthly mirror of the stars above. But it was the towers of silence outside the city that truly reshaped Marco's understanding of the sacred. On these circular platforms, Zoroastrians laid their dead beneath the open sky, allowing vultures to strip the bones clean. To European eyes, it might have seemed grotesque, but the priests explained their logic with quiet conviction. Earth and fire were too pure to be contaminated by decay. By returning bodies to nature this way, they honored creation's balance. Marco, who'd seen Venetian nobles buried in marble tombs beneath churches, found himself marveling at a philosophy where death wasn't hidden away, but integrated into the rhythm of life. The encounter left him questioning assumptions he'd never known were assumptions. In Yazd, he met scholars who spoke of a single benevolent God centuries before Christ, of judgment and resurrection long before Christian missionaries reached Persia. Their ethic, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, echoed the Sermon on the Mount in spirit if not in letter. When a high priest showed him an astrolabe crafted to track the movements of Tishtria, the rain-bringing star, Marco realized how much of the pagan world had been mapping divine patterns while Europe still clung to flat earth myths. By the time his caravan departed, the flames of Yazd had ignited something unexpected in Marco, not conversion but recognition. Here was proof that wisdom didn't flow in one direction from Jerusalem or Rome. It flickered in desert temples and mountain observatories, in rituals that had endured since the days when Cyrus the Great ruled these lands. The Zoroastrians didn't just tend fire, they guarded an unbroken chain of devotion stretching back to the dawn of civilization. And for a traveler whose world was expanding with every mile, that revelation was more precious than any spice or jewel. The first sight of Kublai Khan's summer palace at Hangzhou struck Marco Polo like a waking dream. 12 miles of gilded pavilions nestled in emerald grasslands, their rooftops curved like the wings of dragons in flight. As he passed through gates inlaid with mother-of-pearl, the air itself seemed richer here, scented with sandalwood and the musk of exotic animals. Elephants draped in brocade carried nobles through courtyards where Persian astronomers debated with Chinese mathematicians, their voices mingling with the chime of silver bells. This wasn't just a ruler's home, it was the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea, and Kublai Khan held its threads together with the precision of a master weaver. What stunned Marco most wasn't the wealth, though there was enough gold leaf to blind a man at noon, but the deliberate cosmopolitanism. The great Khan's advisors included Nestorian Christians from Syria, Muslim engineers from Samarkand, even a Tibetan Lama who could reportedly summon rain clouds with a chant. At state banquets, Marco watched as dishes from a dozen culinary traditions appeared in succession. Steamed dumplings delicate as rose petals, Persian lambs stewed with apricots, even a mysterious frozen delicacy of milk and honey packed in mountain snow. The message was unmistakable. This court didn't conquer cultures, it collected them, refined them, and made them part of a grander design. The hunting expeditions revealed another layer of Mongol genius. Marco described vast battus where 10,000 riders drove everything from tigers to snow leopards toward the Khan's viewing stand, not for slaughter but as living proof of nature's bounty. The falconers alone represented a diplomatic corps, their birds gifts from vassal kings, each species a feathered treaty. And when Kublai rode out, it was on a mobile palace of 400 ox-drawn carts, complete with gardens and a portable audience hall where he settled disputes between merchants from places most Europeans didn't believe existed. Yet for all the spectacle, Marco recognized the administrative brilliance beneath the glitter. The Khan's famed Courier system, a network of relay stations with fresh horses every 25 miles, meant news traveled faster here than in Christendom. Paper money, stamped with vermilion seals, eliminated the need for coin-laden mule trains. Even the court's multilingual scribes embodied efficiency, drafting edicts simultaneously in Mongolian, Persian, and Uyghur to speed governance across continents. This encounter demolished Marco's and later Europe's notion of Mongols as mere destroyers. In Chengdu, he saw a civilization that measured progress not by how much it rejected, but by how skillfully it absorbed. The lesson would stay with him. True power lay not in walls or weapons, but in the ability to weave difference into harmony. And as he stood in that golden court, surrounded by the hum of a dozen languages and the scent of 100 spices, Marco realized he wasn't just witnessing history. He was walking through the blueprint of the modern world. The marketplace of Dodu hummed with a sound Marco Polo had never heard before, the crisp rustle of paper changing hands. Not scrolls or deeds, but money itself, light as leaves yet bearing the weight of empires. To a Venetian raised on the clink of silver ducats, the sight of merchants weighing bolts of silk against printed notes stamped with vermilion seals seemed like something from a fable. Yet here in Kublai Khan's capital, paper currency wasn't just real. It was the lifeblood of commerce, its value so unquestioned that refusing it carried the death penalty. Marco's descriptions of this financial revolution read like a detective unraveling a brilliant crime. Each note he recorded was crafted from the bark of mulberry trees, fibers so tightly pressed they could survive years of handling. But the true genius lay in the system backing them. Unlike Europe's haphazard jumble of coinage from 100 mints, these notes drew authority from the Khan himself, their worth guaranteed by vast government stores of silk and silver. A trader could walk into any treasury from Hangzhou to the Pamirs and exchange paper for precious goods at fixed rates. No more haggling over clipped coins or suspecting foreign currencies. The entire economy moved with a fluidity that made European markets seem primitive by comparison. What fascinated Marco most was how this innovation reshaped society. Soldiers received salaries in lightweight notes rather than cumbersome sacks of grain. Taxes flowed efficiently to the capital without bandits targeting bullion-laden carts. Even the Khan's famed generosity took paper form. He'd toss handfuls of notes to crowds during festivals, watching as wealth circulated like autumn leaves in the wind. The psychological shift was profound. Money became less a physical object than an idea, its power rooted in collective trust rather than metal content. Yet when Marco later described this system to Venetian bankers, they clutched their coin purses and laughed. The notion that people would accept paper for gold seemed as absurd as claiming trees could walk. It took centuries before Europe grasped what the Mongols had perfected, that currency's true value isn't in what it's made of, but in the stability of the hands that issue it. By then, Marco's tales of financial sorcery had already planted seeds that would blossom into modern banking. The irony: those same skeptical Europeans would one day build their fortunes on stock certificates and bonds, descendants of the very system they dismissed as a traveler's tall tale. In the end, the paper money encounter wasn't just about economics. It revealed a cultural chasm. Where the East saw trust as a scaffold for progress, the West still clung to the weight of tangible metal. Marco, ever the bridge between worlds, became the first to show that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas aren't forged in fire but pressed from pulp and ink. The Gobi Desert stretched before Marco Polo like a sea frozen mid-storm, waves of sand cresting 30 stories high, their razor-sharp ridges glowing amber under the setting sun. Just as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm his caravan, the dunes began to sing. Not metaphorically, but with an actual chorus of deep, resonant tones that vibrated through the traveler's bones. Somewhere between a Buddhist chant and a cello's lowest note, the sound seemed to emanate from the sand itself, rising and falling with the wind's invisible fingers plucking the grains like some celestial instrument. Local guides dropped to their knees, whispering of desert spirits warning intruders away, but Marco, ever the merchant's son, knelt to scoop a handful of singing sand into his leather pouch, determined to unravel the mystery. What Marco documented would baffle Europe for centuries. The phenomenon, now known as booming dunes, occurs when perfectly round, polished grains of sand slide in synchronized avalanches down steep slopes. The vibrations create frequencies between 60 and 100 Hz, low enough to feel as much as here. Modern scientists would later discover these dunes need three precise conditions: quartz sand weathered to glass-like smoothness, humidity under 2%, and slopes at exactly 30 degrees. But to 13th century ears, it was pure magic. Marco's account captured both perspectives: the shaman who interpreted different tones as voices of ancestors, and the Arab geographer who theorized about wind chambers beneath the surface. This encounter revealed Marco's genius as a bridge between worlds. Where other travelers might dismiss local beliefs as superstition, he recognized their poetic truth. The desert did speak, even if not through literal spirits. His notes describe how Mongolian herders used the dunes' songs as natural compasses, their pitch shifting with the cardinal directions, while Persian scholars mapped acoustic patterns to predict sandstorms. To Marco, the singing sands weren't just curiosities. They were proof that nature's marvels often defied simple categories of science or myth. A phenomenon could be both a vibrational physics lesson and a sacred encounter, depending on who was listening. The deeper lesson resonated through his later writings, whether describing Tibetan monks using echoes to measure mountain heights or Sumatran sailors navigating by bioluminescent plankton. Marco consistently honored both measurement and meaning. The singing dunes became a metaphor for his entire journey, a reminder that wonder and understanding need not be rivals. Centuries before the Enlightenment split observation from imagination, this medieval merchant showed they could dance together as harmoniously as those grains of sand, creating something far richer than either could produce alone. And in doing so, he gave Europe its first inkling that the natural world held mysteries no less astonishing than the golden cities they craved, if only one knew how to listen. High in the thin air of the Himalayas, where the wind carried whispers of ancient mantras, Marco Polo encountered a ritual that would test even his famously open mind. On a windswept plateau near Lhasa, he watched as Buddhist monks carried a wrapped body to a stone platform carved with intricate symbols. There, under the endless blue sky, Rojyapa's body breakers performed their sacred duty with rhythmic precision, using silver knives to prepare the remains for what Tibetans called jeta, the giving alms to birds. Vultures circled above like living shadows, their wings spanning the width of small carts, descending only when the monks stepped back with bowed heads. To Venetian eyes, accustomed to crypts and candlelit cathedrals, the scene might have seemed gruesome. But Marco, through his meticulous notes, captured something far deeper, a philosophy where death wasn't an end but a final act of generosity. What struck him most was the profound intentionality behind every gesture. The monks explained how sky burial aligned with core Buddhist principles: the impermanence of flesh, the illusion of the self, the interconnectedness of all beings. By offering their bodies to scavengers, the deceased achieved two sacred purposes: preventing other creatures from killing to survive, and returning physical form to the cycle of existence as swiftly as a river rejoins the sea. Marco recorded how families spoke of their loved ones flying to heaven on vultures' wings, a poetic image that softened the visceral reality. He noted the practical wisdom too. In this rocky land where wood was scarce for cremation and the frozen ground resisted digging, sky burial was both ecologically necessary and spiritually elegant. The contrast with European funerary practices couldn't have been starker. Where Venice entombed its dead in marble sarcophagi beneath churches, as if trying to preserve what time would inevitably claim, Tibet embraced decay as natural and even holy. Marco described watching a senior monk comfort grieving relatives by comparing the body to a borrowed coat, valuable while worn, but not the essence of the person. This perspective resonated with his own observations along the Silk Road, where he'd seen Zoroastrian towers of silence and Mongolian sky graves. Each culture, he realized, had developed its own language for speaking the unspeakable, its own rituals for facing the universal mystery. Perhaps the most telling detail in Marco's account isn't the burial itself, but what happened afterward. As the vultures took flight, their bellies full, the family distributed barley flour and butter tea to everyone present, including Marco and his travel-worn companions. In that moment, shared sweetness on their tongues and the vast sky overhead, death became not a divider but a bridge. The merchant from Venice, who'd grown up fearing the wrath of a judgmental god, found himself contemplating a different possibility, that the end of life could be approached not with dread but with quiet reverence for nature's economy. This encounter, more than any jewel or spice, revealed Marco's extraordinary growth as a cultural interpreter. Where other medieval travelers might have recoiled or condemned, he sought understanding. His notes on sky burials contain neither lurid sensationalism nor shallow approval, but something rarer, a genuine effort to convey the logic and beauty within practices utterly foreign to his homeland. In doing so, he gave Europe its first glimpse of a spiritual tradition that saw death not as a wall, but as a door left slightly ajar with wings waiting on the other side. The waters off Sri Lanka's coast shimmered like liquid sapphire, hiding treasures that lured men into the jaws of danger. Marco Polo stood on the deck of a fishing boat, watching as divers tied stones to their waists and gripped knives between their teeth, their bodies glistening with coconut oil to ward off the cold. With a single deep breath, they vanished beneath the waves, descending into a world where pearls grew like frozen dewdrops in the mouths of oysters, and where death waited in the form of circling sharks and tangled ropes. For these men, each plunge was a gamble with the ocean itself, a dance on the knife's edge between wealth and oblivion. Marco's notes capture the brutal arithmetic of the pearl trade. Divers could stay submerged for barely 2 minutes, their lungs burning as they pried oysters from coral crevices. The pressure at such depths left many bleeding from their ears, while others surfaced paralyzed from encounters with venomous sea snakes. Yet what fascinated him most wasn't the physical toll, it was the rituals woven around the danger. Before diving, crews chanted prayers to a local goddess, their voices rising and falling with the waves. They tossed handfuls of rice into the water as offerings, believing the grains could distract sharks from human flesh. Some wore amulets filled with mysterious herbs, while others refused to speak certain words at sea, fearing they'd summon storms. To a Venetian accustomed to calculating risks in silver and interest rates, this blend of bravery and superstition was both alien and profoundly human. The true cost of these gems unfolded onshore. Marco described sorting tables where merchants, often Arab or Persian traders, examined each pearl under magnifying glasses, their practiced eyes assigning value with clinical precision. A single perfect specimen could buy a diver's family a year of comfort, but most earned barely enough to feed themselves. The finest pearls, creamy white with an inner fire, vanished into velvet-lined boxes bound for the courts of Kublai Khan or the sultans of Delhi. Meanwhile, the divers' children played barefoot in the sand, their fathers' missing fingers and salt-ravaged lungs testaments to luxury's hidden toll. This encounter haunted Marco because it mirrored a pattern he'd seen across continents. Whether in the silver mines of Anatolia or the spice plantations of Java, the world's most coveted treasures were invariably harvested by those who could least afford their splendor. His account doesn't moralize, it simply observes, letting the contrast between the divers' calloused hands and the jeweled necks of distant noblewomen speak for itself. Yet between the lines, a question lingers: how many lives shimmer inside a single pearl? The answer, like those gems hidden in the deep, remains just out of reach, glinting darkly beneath the surface of his words. The air in Calicut's spice market hit Marco Polo like a living thing, thick with the peppery bite of cardamom, the honeyed warmth of cinnamon, and something else, something deeper that stung the back of his throat and made his eyes water. Black pepper, mountains of it piled in woven baskets taller than a man, their contents so precious that guards stood watch with curved blades gleaming in the sun. Merchants weighed the tiny black spheres on scales balanced with bird feathers, measuring out fortunes by the ounce. To a Venetian raised on bland winter stews, this riot of scent and color wasn't just commerce, it was alchemy. What stunned Marco wasn't just the abundance, but the stories coiled around each spice like tendrils of vine. A Persian trader showed him cinnamon sticks, whispering how they were harvested from nests built by giant birds on cliffs too steep for men to climb. Tales Marco would later learn were clever fabrications to justify exorbitant prices. Nearby, Ayurvedic healers ground turmeric with ritual precision, explaining how its golden powder could mend wounds and purify blood. Even the haggling followed rhythms older than the pyramids. Arab merchants clapped hands to seal deals, while Chinese brokers used abacuses to calculate sums in real time, their beads clicking like insects in the heat. Every transaction carried layers of meaning. Pepper wasn't just a seasoning here, but currency, medicine, even dowry. The true revelation came when Marco followed the spice trails inland. In the emerald hills of the Western Ghats, he watched farmers tend pepper vines coiled around areca palms like jealous serpents. The harvest was a dance of danger. Workers braved clouds of angry bees to pluck the green berries, their hands swelling from the toxins. Yet the real magic happened after drying, when ordinary fruit transformed into wrinkled black gold. Marco's notes capture the paradox. These unassuming pellets, lighter than raindrops, could buy silks in Hangzhou or horses in Samarkand. A single sack might pass through 20 hands: Malayali growers, Tamil middlemen, Arab ship captains, before flavoring a sultan's feast half a world away. This encounter reshaped Marco's understanding of value itself. Back in Europe, nobles displayed wealth through gold or land, but here power was measured in ephemera. The way a Roger's breath might smell of cloves from distant Maluku, or how a merchant's fingertips stayed forever stained yellow from handling ginger. The spices taught him that desire could be bottled in bark and seed, that the human palate would drive empires to cross oceans and topple kingdoms. By the time he left Malabar, his notebooks bursting with sketches of nutmeg flowers and tamarind pods, Marco carried a new truth. The world's most explosive revolutions weren't always fought with swords. Sometimes they simmered quietly in a pot on the fire, changing history one mouthful at a time. The moment Marco Polo's boat slipped into Hangzhou's labyrinth of canals, he felt the eerie familiarity of a dream. Venice's reflection warped through some celestial funhouse mirror. 12,000 bridges arched over waterways thrice as wide as the Grand Canal, their stone curves thronged with merchants hawking lacquerware and scholars reciting poetry to the rhythm of passing oars. But where Venice's alleys whispered of seafaring isolation, Hangzhou pulsed with the confidence of an empire's heartbeat. Marco's notes gush with disbelief. A single street stretched over 5 miles, lined with lanterns that transformed night into a river of fireflies. Here was urban planning as high art, a metropolis of over 1 million souls where public granaries warded off famine, and fire brigades raced through dedicated lanes faster than Venetian gondoliers could curse. What truly set Hangzhou apart wasn't just scale, but a quality Marco could only describe as perfected living. Tea houses perched on stilts above the water served brews so exquisite that patrons could identify the mountain slope where leaves were plucked by taste alone. Silk workshops employed thousands, their looms weaving patterns so intricate they supposedly took 3 generations to master. Grandfathers drafted designs, fathers dyed threads with secret mineral formulas, sons worked the shuttles. Even the bathhouses were revelations of civic luxury. Marco described marble chambers where patrons soaked in scented pools, then retired to rooftop gardens for massages accompanied by zither music. To a European accustomed to wooden tubs hauled indoors once a year, this was hygiene as transcendent experience. the festivals left him breathless with their orchestrated chaos. On the Moon Festival, lanterns shaped like dragons and phoenixes floated down canals, their colored light flickering on the faces of laughing children. New Year's brought fireworks that didn't just explode, they unfolded like mechanical peacocks, spraying sparks in precise geometric patterns. Marco learned these pyrotechnics weren't mere entertainment, but military technology repurposed for joy, invented by the same alchemists who'd once perfected gunpowder. The message was unmistakable. This was a culture so secure in its power that it could turn weapons into wonder. Yet for all its grandeur, Hangzhou's genius lay in details Marco alone seemed to notice. The way fishermen used cormorants with silver rings around their necks tight enough to prevent swallowing large fish but loose for smaller catches, creating a living fishing net. How street vendors kept noodles warm in partitioned bronze pots, each layer steaming at different temperatures. Even the city's sewage system, a network of brick channels flushed daily by tide gates, put Venice's stinking alleyways to shame. When Marco later called Hangzhou, beyond dispute the finest and noblest city in the world, he wasn't just comparing stone to stone. He'd glimpsed something revolutionary, an urban vision where beauty and efficiency weren't rivals, but partners in a dance perfected over centuries. The canals may have reminded him of home, but the philosophy behind them was utterly alien to medieval Europe, that a city's greatness should be measured not by its walls or wealth, but by the quality of life it gifted even its humblest dweller. This revelation would ripple through European urban design for centuries, popping up in unlikely places from the public gardens of Paris to the municipal water systems of Amsterdam. Each innovation a faint echo of that city of heaven Marco could never quite forget. The thundering hoofbeats of the Yam couriers were the sound of an empire thinking aloud, a relentless day and night relay that turned 6,000 miles of steppe and mountain into something no wider than a village square. Marco Polo watched in awe as riders changed horses at way stations spaced precisely 25 miles apart, the exact distance a fresh mount could cover at full gallop without breaking stride. These weren't just messengers, they were human synapses firing across Kublai Khan's nervous system, carrying everything from military orders to poetry with the urgency of a heartbeat. What shocked Marco most wasn't the speed, though 200 miles a day put European couriers to shame, but the system's ruthless efficiency. Each rider carried a paisa, a tablet of gold or silver engraved with the Khan's falcon seal that functioned like a medieval VPN, granting instant clearance through any territory. Lose a message and the penalty wasn't just death, it was the obliteration of your entire family line. The way stations themselves were marvels of logistics. Marco described sprawling compounds with stables housing 500 horses, dormitories for couriers, and even dedicated scribes who could translate documents between Mongolian, Persian, and Uyghur on the fly. Some larger hubs kept herds of replacement horses grazing in rotating shifts, their coats glistening from daily grooming to prevent saddle sores. The real genius, though, lay in the encryption. Sensitive messages were written in coded scrolls that only designated officials could decipher, while routine dispatches used a system of knotted ribbons and notched sticks, an early form of binary communication that allowed illiterate riders to verify authenticity by touch. Marco's account reveals how this network transformed governance. A tax collector in distant Kashgar could receive updated quota instructions within a week. A rebellion brewing on the Korean peninsula might be crushed by Mongol cavalry before local farmers even finished harvesting their barley. But the Yam's most revolutionary impact was cultural. Alongside military dispatches, riders carried treatises on Arabic medicine, Chinese astronomy, and Persian music theory, creating a cross-continental dialogue that turned Kublai's capital into a medieval Silicon Valley. When Marco described this system to Venetian officials, they scoffed at the notion that paper could move faster than ships. It would take Europe another 500 years to establish anything comparable, and even then, Napoleon's semaphore towers couldn't match the Yam's all-weather reliability. What Marco grasped and what made this encounter so pivotal was that the Mongols hadn't just built roads, they'd hacked time itself. By collapsing the lag between command and execution, the Yam turned geography from a barrier into a tool. The lesson resonated through his later writings. True power in the modern world wouldn't belong to those who controlled land, but to those who mastered the flow of information. In that sense, those dusty riders galloping into the night weren't just couriers, they were the first packets of data racing across a prototype internet, proving that even in the 13th century, connectivity was the ultimate superpower. The grasslands of Mongolia stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it made Marco Polo feel like a speck of dust on heaven's floor, until the thunder of approaching hooves shattered the illusion. What emerged from the horizon wasn't the expected band of hardened warriors, but a hunting party where women rode astride stallions with the same lethal grace as their male counterparts, their bows drawn and arrows nocked before Marco could even register their faces. In that dizzying moment, every assumption about gender he'd carried from Venice unraveled like a poorly tied knot. These weren't just companions or camp followers. They were equals in a society where skill, not sex, determined one's place. Marco's journals brim with astonished accounts of noblewomen like Cuchulain, the wrestling princess who demanded 100 horses from any suitor she could pin to the ground and retired undefeated with 10,000 steeds to her name. He described court sessions where Kublai Khan's own daughters presided over legal disputes, their judgments as final as any man's. Even domestic life defied European norms. Mongol wives managed family wealth with the precision of Venetian bankers, controlling everything from herds to trade contracts while their husbands campaigned abroad. The cultural shockwaves of this encounter ripple through Marco's writing. Where medieval Europe cloistered noblewomen in tapestried chambers, Mongol girls learned to ride before they could walk and debated politics by the time they turned 12. He recorded how a general's wife single-handedly organized the siege logistics for her husband's army, calculating supply lines with an abacus strapped to her saddle. Another noblewoman, he noted, commanded a garrison so fiercely that invading forces turned back rather than face her reputation alone. These weren't exceptions to the rule, they were the rule in a land where survival demanded every able hand regardless of gender. What made these observations revolutionary wasn't just their content, but their timing. Back home, scholars preached that women's natural weakness required male protection, a belief enshrined in laws and sermons alike. Yet here were societies thriving precisely because they ignored such restrictions. Marco's accounts of Mongol women became quiet grenades tossed into European thought, their implications simmering for centuries. If women could lead armies and negotiate treaties here, what did that say about the divine order back home? Perhaps the most telling detail lies not in Marco's grand narratives, but in a passing observation about an ordinary evening in a yurt. As he shared a meal with a family, he watched a grandmother casually rest her booted foot on a wrestling trophy while mending a broken arrow, her granddaughter practicing calligraphy beside her with equal nonchalance. No fanfare, no debate about propriety, just people being people. In that unguarded moment, Marco glimpsed the deepest truth of all, that culture is a costume, not a cage. And sometimes it takes seeing others wear entirely different garments to realize your own might not be stitched by the gods after all. The first time Marco Polo saw coal burning in a Chinese hearth, he thought he was witnessing some dark sorcery. These weren't the familiar logs of oak or pine that warmed Venetian palaces. These were glossy black stones, torn from the earth and set ablaze with a heat so intense it could melt iron. In his notes, he described the moment with near reverent disbelief, how miners in Shanxi province dug deep shafts to extract the strange fuel, how merchants transported it by the cartload to cities where it burned day and night in public bathhouses and imperial foundries. To European eyes, accustomed to denuding entire forests for warmth, the efficiency was staggering. A single basket of these black stones could outlast a wagon of firewood, their embers glowing for days like captured fragments of the underworld. What fascinated Marco most wasn't just the coal itself, but the ecosystem around it. He recorded how miners used bamboo pipelines to vent poisonous gases from tunnels, an early form of ventilation system, and how children sorted the extracted chunks by size and quality with hands blackened as if dipped in ink. The fuel transformed every industry it touched. Porcelain kilns reached temperatures previously unimaginable, producing ceramics so translucent they rang like bells when struck. Iron smelters, once limited by how many trees they could fell, now churned out weapons and tools by the thousands, their furnaces roaring like dragons fed on stone. Even the poorest households burned coal dust pressed into briquettes, an innovation that meant no one froze even when blizzards sealed mountain passes for months. The reaction back in Venice when Marco described this burning earth ranged from skepticism to outright mockery. Wood merchants scoffed at the idea that stones could replace honest timber, while clerics muttered about hellish substances unfit for Christian hearths. It didn't help that Marco's account included details that strained credulity: whole mountainsides set ablaze by lightning strikes, or miners descending into the very bowels of the earth where the air itself could kill. To audiences raised on biblical cosmology, where fire was a divine element, the notion of harvesting it from rocks felt as absurd as claiming one could bottle sunlight. Yet buried in their disbelief lay a cultural blind spot Europe wouldn't confront for centuries. While the Chinese had been mining coal since the Han Dynasty, using it to brew tea, forge coins, and even mint the world's first paper currency, the West remained wedded to living forests for fuel. Marco's observations hinted at a coming revolution, that true progress often hid in humble innovations, not just glittering treasures. The same black stones that heated a peasant's bathhouse in Cathay would one day power the steam engines of Manchester and Pittsburgh, turning his tall tale into the bedrock of the industrial age. The irony wasn't lost on Marco. In his final years, he'd reportedly keep a chunk of Shanxi coal on his writing desk, not as a paperweight but as a reminder that the most transformative ideas often arrive wrapped in soot and grime, waiting for the world to recognize their spark. The jungles of Java rose from the sea like a mirage, emerald canopies dripping with vines, their shadows hiding kingdoms Marco Polo had heard described in whispers that mixed gold with horror. His accounts of this island read like pages torn from two different books, one detailing a land where kings powdered their bodies with gold dust and elephants wore armor of beaten precious metals, the other warning of tribes who allegedly feasted on human flesh deep in the mountainous interior. To Venetian ears accustomed to tidy categories of civilized and savage, Java defied easy labels. Here was a place where a single coastline could harbor both a thriving spice port with paved streets and a village where skulls hung from the rafters as trophies. Marco's descriptions of Java's wealth weren't pure fantasy. The island's volcanic soil yielded pepper and nutmeg that fetched fortunes in Cairo and Constantinople, while its rivers carried flecks of gold so abundant that prospectors needed only woven baskets to sift them from the silt. He marveled at Javanese metallurgy, how artisans alloyed gold with other metals to create a substance called tembaga that mimicked pure gold's luster but resisted tarnishing. Yet for every accurate observation, his journals also repeated local legends as fact. Stories of dog-headed men in the highlands or tribes who could vanish into trees likely came from misunderstandings of Javanese folklore or deliberate tall tales spun by traders protecting their routes. The cannibal rumors, probably conflated with real but rare ancestor veneration rituals involving symbolic consumption of ashes, a nuance lost in translation across 5 languages. What makes this encounter pivotal isn't just the blend of truth and exaggeration, but how it shaped Europe's vision of the East. Marco's Java became a Rorschach test. Merchants fixated on the gold, missionaries shuddered at the godless savages, and cartographers scrambled to redraw their maps. His account gave the island a mythical weight far beyond its size, planting seeds that would later grow into the spice race between Portuguese and Dutch explorers. The very contradictions in his reporting reveal a deeper truth. Exploration was never just about recording facts. It was about framing the unfamiliar in terms the familiar world could digest, even if that meant seasoning reality with a pinch of fantasy. The irony, while Europeans debated whether Java was El Dorado or Hell's Annex, the island's actual inhabitants were busy creating a civilization that blended Hindu epics with indigenous wisdom, where astronomers tracked comets with bronze instruments while poets composed verses about the sacredness of rice. Marco glimpsed fragments, the shadow puppet plays that retold the Mahabharata, the intricate irrigation systems feeding terraced rice paddies, but his narrative couldn't yet process a culture so complex. That tension between what he saw and what he understood mirrors every cultural encounter in history. The other always gets simplified before it gets comprehended, reduced to gold or monsters before revealing its true, messy, magnificent self. Centuries later, archaeologists would confirm some of Marco's wildest claims, like the existence of the Majapahit Empire's golden thrones, while debunking others. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of his Javanese encounter is the reminder that every traveler's tale is really two stories, one about the place visited and another about the cultural lens through which it was seen. The cannibals may have been mythical, but the hunger behind Marco's telling was all too human, the craving to astonish, to terrify, and above all, to be believed. The rugged highlands of Armenia unfolded before Marco Polo like a psalm carved in stone cliffs, dotted with monasteries so ancient their foundations seemed to grow from the earth itself. After months traversing Islamic kingdoms and Buddhist realms, the sight of crosses etched into mountain chapels struck him with the force of a homecoming. Yet these weren't the soaring Gothic cathedrals of Europe, but low-domed sanctuaries adorned with intricate knotwork and frescoes of dark-eyed saints, their halos glowing against indigo backgrounds. Inside, priests chanted liturgy in a language that echoed the Aramaic of Christ's own tongue, their voices mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and mountain herbs. For a traveler raised on Venetian Catholicism, the familiarity was comforting, but the context was utterly alien. Here, Christianity wasn't just surviving under Mongol rule, it was flourishing. Armenian bishops moved freely through Karakoram's court, their ruby-studded crosses swinging alongside the wolf-tail standards of Mongol generals. Marco documented how local princes, though vassals to the great Khan, still minted coins bearing the Lamb of God alongside inscriptions in Mongol script. The secret lay in a simple bargain. The Mongols demanded unwavering loyalty, not theological conformity. Tax collectors might be Nestorian Christians, provincial governors Buddhist Uyghurs, or Muslim Persians. What mattered was competence, not creed. This pragmatic pluralism stunned Marco, whose homeland was still reeling from the bloodshed of the Albigensian Crusade, where Christians slaughtered Christians over doctrinal nuances. The contrast sharpened at Lake Van's edge, where Marco attended a mass unlike any he'd known. Armenian priests used leavened bread instead of wafers, mixed wine with water in elaborate brass vessels, and swung censers that filled the air with the resinous perfume of frankincense from Arabia. Yet when the service ended, worshippers filed past a stone stele carved with Mongol imperial edicts, a visible reminder of their dual allegiance. One elderly deacon, noticing Marco's fascination, explained their survival strategy. We pray for the Khan's health every Sunday. When your roof is held up by another's pillars, you don't insult the architect. This encounter peeled back layers of Marco's assumptions. In Europe, faith and power were welded together. Kingdoms defined themselves as Christendom's bulwarks against infidels. But the Mongol Empire proved religion could be personal while governance remained secular. He recorded how Armenian merchants leveraged their Christian networks to dominate trade from Constantinople to Canton, their letters of credit honored in both papal Rome and Buddhist Tibet. Their churches became way stations for travelers of all faiths, with scriptoriums where Jewish scribes copied medical texts alongside gospel illuminations. What Marco couldn't yet grasp was how fragile this equilibrium was. Within decades, the rise of militant Islam would shatter Armenia's golden age, leaving those mountain monasteries as lonely sentinels of a lost cosmopolitanism. But in that brief moment, he witnessed something radical: proof that devotion didn't require domination, that faith could cross borders without drawing swords. It was a lesson Europe wouldn't learn for centuries, buried like a seed in his travelogue, waiting for a more tolerant age to take root. The domed Observatory of Marrakei rose from the Persian plains like a temple built for the heavens themselves, its walls lined with brass instruments so precise they could track a star's path across the sky down to the width of a hair. When Marco Polo stepped inside, the air hummed with whispered calculations in Arabic, Persian, and Syriac as robed scholars adjusted quadrant rings and scribbled figures on parchment. One white-bearded astronomer, noticing the Venetian's wide-eyed stare, invited him to peer through a tubular device longer than a man's arm. Through its lens, the craters of the moon appeared close enough to touch, their jagged edges defying Aristotle's claim that celestial bodies were perfect spheres. For a merchant raised on church dogma, it was a moment of vertigo, as if the sky itself had cracked open to reveal its secrets. What unfolded over the following weeks rewired Marco's understanding of knowledge itself. These weren't just stargazers, they were human calculators who could predict lunar eclipses to the minute years in advance. Their Zij tables, star catalogues combining Greek geometry, Indian trigonometry, and Chinese eclipse records, allowed navigators to plot courses across uncharted oceans with mathematical certainty. Yet their genius wasn't confined to cold numbers. The same scholar who calibrated an astrolabe with micrometer precision might later cast a natal horoscope for a newborn prince, seeing no contradiction between measuring orbits and interpreting cosmic omens. To these savants, the universe was both clock and oracle, its mechanics and meanings inextricably linked. Marco's notes capture the intellectual alchemy at work. Persian astronomers had calculated Earth's circumference to within 4% of its actual size 6 centuries before European ships would prove the world wasn't flat. Their armillary spheres modeled planetary movements so accurately that even Mongol Khans, no strangers to conquest, deferred to their celestial forecast. But what truly dazzled him was their collaborative spirit. In the observatory's scriptorium, Christian scribes copied Arabic treatises while Jewish physicians cross-referenced medical charts with planetary positions. Knowledge here flowed like water through an irrigation network, nourishing every field it touched. The encounter's ripple effects would eventually reach further than Marco could have dreamed. When he described Marrakei's revolving library, where books were shelved on rotating wooden wheels for instant access, the concept would inspire Venice's first public libraries centuries later. His sketches of water-powered celestial globes found their way into Da Vinci's notebooks. Most importantly, the Persian model of state-funded research centers planted seeds for Europe's scientific revolution, proving that progress thrived where curiosity was given tools and patronage. Yet for all their brilliance, the astronomer's greatest lesson was one of humility. One clear night, as Marco watched an elderly scholar correct his own star charts based on fresh observations, he asked why such a learned man would bother. The answer came softly: because the heavens owe us no truths. Only by admitting our errors do we earn the right to glimpse their wonders. In that moment, under a sky ablaze with constellations those men had mapped but never fully mastered, Marco grasped the true meaning of exploration, not the conquest of knowledge, but the endless pursuit of it. The creature swayed into view like something from a traveler's fever dream, its neck stretching toward the canopy, legs so impossibly long they seemed borrowed from 4 different animals. When Marco Polo first laid eyes on the Bengal Sultan's prized gift from Africa, his quill hesitated. No Latin bestiary had prepared him for this living paradox, a beast with the patterned cloak of a leopard, the hooves of a stag, and a tongue so dexterous it could pluck leaves from thorn branches untouched. Camelopard, he finally wrote, stitching together camel and leopard into a clumsy approximation that would baffle European scholars for generations. What makes this encounter extraordinary isn't just Marco's struggle to classify the giraffe. It's how his flawed description revealed the limits of medieval imagination. Back home, scholars still debated whether rhinos were armored horses or dragons misplaced in the animal kingdom. The giraffe, with its quiet grace and alien proportions, defied every category. Marco's notes oscillate between awe and comedy. He marveled at its ability to drink from puddles without bending, as if the earth itself bowed to meet it, but insisted its neck contained only 7 vertebrae like humans, a myth that persisted until dissections proved otherwise centuries later. The Bengal court knew exactly what they were doing when they showcased this living marvel. Giraffes had been diplomatic currency since antiquity. Ptolemy Roman II paraded one through Alexandria, and the Ming dynasty's Yongle emperor displayed African specimens as proof of his global reach. For Marco, witnessing the Sultan's guests gasp as the animal lowered its head to accept fruit from their hands was a masterclass in soft power. No army could impress like this ambling ambassador from a continent Europe barely knew existed. Yet the real magic lay in how the giraffe bridged worlds. Arab traders called it Zarafa, the lovely one, while Chinese artists depicted it alongside Qilin, mythical hooved dragons. Marco's camelopard became a Rorschach test for cultural perception. Was it a monster, a marvel, or just another creature going about its day in a world vaster than anyone had dreamed? His description, though inaccurate, did something revolutionary. It pried open European minds to the possibility that Africa wasn't just a land of gold and savages, but of living wonders no bestiary had yet named. The giraffe's quiet legacy outlasted Marco's travels. When Cosimo de' Medici later imported one to Florence, crowds wept at its beauty, seeing divine craftsmanship in its patchwork design. That moment in Bengal, when a Venetian merchant stood slack-jawed before a creature he couldn't name, was the first stitch in a tapestry that would eventually weave the world's ecosystems into shared understanding. Not through conquest or conversion, but through the simple, staggering power of a leaf-munching giant that made myth look mundane by comparison. The jungles of Burma unfolded before Marco Polo in shades of emerald and gold, but what truly stole his breath were the human canvases walking among the bamboo groves. Men and women alike bore intricate designs swirling across their limbs, not crude markings like the sailors' tattoos back in Venice, but living masterpieces where serpents coiled around wrists and celestial patterns fanned across shoulders like unfolded wings. These weren't decorations, they were biographies in ink. A warrior's throat might be tattooed with concentric circles, each ring representing a vanquished enemy, while a healer's hands could shimmer with medicinal symbols believed to channel ancestral wisdom. Even the children wore delicate dots along their spines, a rite of passage as sacred as any European baptism. Marco's notes quiver with fascination as he describes the tattooing ritual itself. Artists used needles attached to bamboo rods, tapping them with mallets to drive pigment deep into the skin. The process wasn't merely painful, it was a trial by fire. Men seeking status as hunters would endure days of work without flinching, their stillness proving worthiness to lead. Some designs incorporated magical formulas, tiny Sanskrit prayers or animal spirits believed to repel blades and arrows. A village elder showed Marco his chest, where the inked image of a tiger had allegedly turned aside a spear thrust during battle. To a Venetian raised on coats of arms and embroidered heraldry, these were more than symbols. They were armor forged under the skin, permanent as bone. What unsettled Marco wasn't the tattoos themselves, but their fluidity of meaning. In Burma, a woman's facial markings might declare her clan lineage, while identical patterns on a man's back could signify his prowess in elephant hunting. The same swirling motif that protected a fisherman from crocodiles might adorn a dancer as tribute to the gnats, the capricious spirits haunting every waterfall and banyan tree. Identity here wasn't fixed at birth. It accumulated over a lifetime, layer by painful layer, until the body became a walking archive of experience. This encounter peeled back Marco's assumptions about belonging. In Venice, your name and dress announced your place in the rigid hierarchy, but these tattooed tribes carried their stories in a language of symbols that transcended words. When he asked a shaman why they endured such agony for something as fleeting as beauty, the answer came with a smile. You Christians wear your faith in gold around your necks. We wear ours where it cannot be stolen. That night, as fireflies blinked in the humid air, Marco ran a finger over his own unmarked forearm, suddenly aware of its nakedness. For the first time, he questioned whether silk and jewels were the truest way to tell the world who you were. Maybe real wealth wasn't something you carried, but something you became. The canal waters of Venice lapped against familiar stone steps, but the man who stepped ashore might as well have been a stranger. After 24 years tracing the edges of the known world, Marco Polo returned to his birthplace draped not in Venetian velvet, but in the heavy silk robes of a Mongol courtier, the Golden Khan's falcon emblem still gleaming on his belt. When his family gathered for the homecoming feast, their gasps weren't just for his sun-leathered skin or the unfamiliar cadence of his speech. It was the way he moved through the hall, offering spiced mare's milk in porcelain cups instead of wine, presenting sugared lotus roots on jade platters as if the Doge's palace had become a satellite of Shangdu. This was no ordinary banquet. It was a living diorama of everything Venice feared and coveted about the East. Servants circulated with dishes that sounded like incantations. Saffron-infused pilaf steaming with the scent of Samarkand's markets, skewers of mutton rubbed with cumin from the Taklamakan road stands. Marco himself demonstrated the Mongol art of slicing meat with a dagger held backward, his hands moving with the unconscious grace of someone who'd dined with emperors. Every gesture, every spice-laden breath carried the weight of his metamorphosis. The Venetian boy who left was now a man who'd internalized the very cultures Europe still viewed as threats. The real revelation came when Marco unfurled a scroll painted with Chinese landscapes, pointing to mountain ranges that defied the church-approved maps on his uncle's walls. As he spoke of paper money moving faster than ships and cities lit by perpetual lanterns, his relatives' faces flickered between wonder and unease. Here was proof that the world operated on principles beyond their comprehension, delivered by a living ghost who'd absorbed those truths into his bones. Even the family's prized relics, a shard of the true cross, a vial of Holy Land soil, seemed suddenly small against Marco's tales of Tibetan prayer wheels spinning with the force of faiths never mentioned in scripture. What made this final encounter so revolutionary wasn't just the exotic spectacle, but its intimate setting. This wasn't a traveler boasting in some faraway caravanserai. It was a son rewriting his family's understanding of reality at their own dinner table. When Marco insisted Kublai Khan's postal system could outpace Venetian galleys or described coal burning hotter than oak, he wasn't just sharing facts, he was performing alchemy, transmuting their worldview one story at a time. The very spices perfuming the air became arguments against isolationism. The robes he refused to remove a sartorial manifesto. By dessert, a quivering kumis custard that made his mother clutch her rosary. The rift was undeniable. Polos had hoped for their Marco back, but the man before them belonged to the world now. His laughter came slower, measured against memories of desert winds. His eyes lingered on the canal's reflections, as if still searching for the ghostly doubles of pagodas in the water. In that candlelit room, thick with the scent of cardamom and nostalgia, they glimpsed travel's cruelest and most beautiful truth: you can't circle the globe without the globe circling through you. Venice would reclaim his body, but his mind would forever roam those vast spaces between the steppes and the stars, where home wasn't a place you returned to, but 1,000 splinters of everywhere you'd been. Marco Polo's travels did more than just map uncharted territories. They stitched together the fragmented consciousness of a world that didn't yet know its own interconnectedness. Think about it. Before his accounts, Europe's imagination of the East was a hazy collage of monster-filled bestiaries and half-remembered crusader tales. But through his eyes, they glimpsed something revolutionary, a planet where ideas flowed as freely as spices along the Silk Road, where a Mongol emperor could employ Muslim astronomers and Christian advisors without a second thought, where a humble piece of paper stamped with vermilion ink held more power than a chest of gold coins. These weren't just exotic anecdotes, they were seismic shifts in understanding, proving that innovation and wisdom weren't the exclusive property of any one culture. Consider the ripple effects. When Polo described Kublai Khan's paper money, he wasn't just introducing a financial tool. He was handing medieval Europe a blueprint for trust-based economies. His tales of Chinese gunpowder and Persian astronomical instruments didn't just entertain, they planted seeds that would later sprout into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Even his misunderstood accounts of camelopards and singing sands expanded the boundaries of what was considered possible, nudging scholars toward empirical curiosity over blind reliance on ancient texts. The irony, much of what he reported was dismissed as fantasy until later explorers, armed with his book as a guide, proved him right. What makes Polo's legacy endure isn't just the breadth of his journeys, but the depth of his observations. He didn't merely note that Zoroastrians worshipped fire, he captured how their rituals reflected a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, a philosophy that resonated with his own Christian upbringing despite its foreign trappings. When he recounted the Mongol women who wrestled for horses or governed provinces, he wasn't just sharing trivia, he was quietly challenging the rigid gender norms of his homeland. His writings became a mirror held up to Europe, reflecting both its parochialism and its potential. Today, as algorithms dictate what we see and borders grow both more porous and more contested, Polo's travels offer a timeless lesson that progress begins when we trade fear for fascination. His encounters, whether with sky burials in Tibet or multilingual marketplaces in Constantinople, teach us that the things dividing cultures are often thinner than the parchment he wrote on. The real marvel isn't how far he traveled, but how deeply he listened, how willingly he let his assumptions be upended. So as you scroll through a feed that connects you to every corner of the globe in seconds, ask yourself, are we truly more open-minded than those medieval Venetians who scoffed at his stories? Or do we just have better disguises for our disbelief? That's the invitation Marco Polo leaves us with, not to retrace his route, but to embrace his radical curiosity. To recognize that the next world-changing idea might be simmering in a tradition we've dismissed, a place we've overlooked, or a voice we've yet to hear. Which of his encounters sparks your imagination? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this journey through history's great crossroads, hit subscribe to explore more stories where the past doesn't just inform the present, it electrifies it. After all, the greatest discoveries aren't always about new lands, but new ways